Have you ever wondered how the NFL salary cap works? Well, today I'm going to give you a rundown of the basics to get you primed for free agency come March.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, Monday through Friday, including YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by subscribing or downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today is the first of several free agent Fridays where we will be, talking free agency in the lead up to free agency come, the middle of March. And this episode is going to be a salary cap 101. And we did an episode like this like 2 years ago, back in February. And, every now and then you feel like you got to let the people know and make sure that everybody's operating the same wavelength. Because I often see where, like, in the case of the Falcons, like, let's say the Falcons will have like $60 million in cap space. And I'll see fans talking about how, like, the players that we're allowed to fit under the cap, because, like, let's say we do whatever it takes and we sign Jesse Bates for like a $20 million contract. And then we go out there and do whatever it takes and we sign Deron Payne to a $20 million contract. And then we also keep Caleb McGarry on a $15 million contract. And then we go out there and say sign Marcus Davenport for $15 million. And you add up 20 plus 20 plus 15 plus 15. And, that comes to $70 million. And people will assume, like, oh, well, we only have 60 million cap space. We can't fit all those players under the cap. And that's not how the cap works, right? That's not how cap hits are determined, right? And so, I want to hopefully educate some folks that it's a little bit more complicated, but we'll do our best to simplify it. So the bigger picture stuff is the NFL has a hard salary cap, which means that your teams are not allowed to spend more money than that set limit on their players. This year, the cap is set to $224.8 million. So if you hear me say $225 million cap, it's because I just rounded up a couple $100,000. And how much space you have before you hit that hard limit is what is referred to as cap space. Now, when it comes to a player's cap hit, it is not their annual average salary. Cap hits, at least in their most basic form, are basically you take a player's base salary and you take his prorated, which means the average over amount per year bonus money, right? A base salary is essentially what a player gets paid on a weekly basis. He gets 17 game checks over the course of a season, and that's going to make up his base salary, right? A signing bonus is essentially what a player gets up front when they signs a contract, right? And this is not how it really works, but the way you can kind of think about it, let's say Jesse Bates, for example, signs with the Falcons and he signs his name on the dotted contract. They'll post a picture of him smiling as he's signing the contract on the social media. And then what you don't see in the background is Arthur Blank. Let's say he's get a $3 million signing bonus as part of his contract. Arthur Blank then hands him a check for $3 million. That's not actually how it works, but that's essentially how it works. And in reality, a player gets that money up front. He signs that, he can put that in the bank, take the wife and kids to Bali or whatever. But from a cap standpoint, bonus money is spread out over the life of a contract. That's what it means when we prorate it over the course of a contract. So there are other bonuses beyond signing bonuses. There are roster bonuses, option bonuses, workout bonuses, etc. but that's more advanced. That's salary cap 201 stuff. So we'll keep things simple. So let's use a sample contract that, any player player X, whatever, signs a 5-year, $25 million contract that includes a $10 million signing bonus, right? So, you take that total of $25 million, you subtract the bonus. That means the rest of his contract, which is $15 million in this case, is made up of base salaries. Now, a lot of people, again, going back to the previous example I used, where a lot of people will see like, oh, his average salary is $5 million. And so therefore, his cap hit is like $5 million. Like, no, it's not, right? Now, technically, it could be that, but like usually it's not, because typically in the NFL, contracts are backloaded. And what backloading means is that over the course of multiple years of a contract, the salaries start low and then go up each year, right? Where the salaries at the end of the contract are higher than the salaries at the beginning of the contract. And so normally you would assume, okay, if a player is getting $15 million in the course of base salaries over 5 years, you just give them $3 million in each year, 3 million, 3 million, 3 million, et cetera. Right. But the way that NFL contracts are typically structured and backloaded, instead of 3 million every year, it'll be 1 million in the first year, 2 million in the second year, 3 million in the third year, 4 million in the fourth year, and 5 million in the fifth year, still adding up to $15 million. But as you see, the money goes up as the contract rolls on. So going back to the point of determining a player's cap hit, that's the base salary plus the prorated bonus. So in this instance, the prorated bonus, the $10 million signing bonus, is spread out over the 5 years of the contract. That is the one at $2 million per year that is averaged out over the course of the contract. So in this example, where the player's first year base salary was $1 million, his cap hit would be $1 million base salary plus $2 million bonus. So his cap hit would be $3 million. In year two, his cap hit would be $4 million because he's getting a $2 million base plus the $2 million in prorated bonus. Year three, $5 million cap hit, $3 million base, $2 million bonus. Year four, $6 million cap hit. Year seven, $7 million cap hit. You understand the basics. And so the reason why NFL contracts, particularly when it comes to free agents, aren't necessarily seen as like long-term solutions when you sign a free agent. It's really a short-term solution. You'll hear me say that all the time on the podcast. Well, like you sign these guys these 5-year contracts, but you're really only renting them for 2 or 3 years, because typically the way it works in the NFL is like these guys become free agents when like 27. They'll sign these 4 or 5-year contracts that, take them, that keep them locked up until past their age 30. But we know in the NFL, players tend to start to decline as they approach 30. And so what happens is the player starts to decline in terms of his performance, but his salary tends to go up. And essentially NFL teams are like, we're paying you more money than what you're worth. And so we're going to cut you. Right. And so, you have this line that goes up in terms of the player's salary going up. And then you have this line that goes down where the player's play goes down. And there's like a point where those two things cross. And that's usually the time when the NFL teams decide to cut you. And NFL teams can do that because contracts are not guaranteed. And then what happens then is dead money comes into play. And so that's what we're going to talk about to continue today's Salary Cap 101 episode, talking about how cuts and dead money works as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But, outside of the NFL, right, where we're approaching the offseason, it's the midpoint in the NBA season. And it is the perfect time, guys, to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, right? Because now new customers at FanDuel get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000, right? That means that even if your first bet doesn't win, you get bonus bets back, right? Just by downloading the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, it's secure, it's super easy to use, right? And for me, I like to build parlays. And parlays, you bet a little, you win a lot, right? And the thing about FanDuel is they have like this parlay builder where with the NBA, I can look at players and I'm like, okay, I think this player is going to get over 15 points today. Or that guy could probably get over 5 assists, right? Or that guy might get a certain amount of rebounds. And I can sort of mix and match from different games and build a parlay. So I can just bet a little and win a lot. And you can do that too, or you can bet the point spreads or money lines or whatever you want to bet. All you got to do is download the app and take advantage of your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 and bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So the thing that you need to know about the NFL and why the cap is as convoluted and crazy as it is because NFL contracts are not guaranteed, right? Now, in real life, if two parties, you or I, signed a contract, both parties would be expected to honor that contract. And in the NFL, it doesn't quite work that way, right? The teams don't have to honor their contracts, right? They do, but then they can just basically decide, you know what? We don't want to pay you this money anymore, so we're going to tear up the contract, right? And so NFL teams can basically get out of contracts whenever they want. But as a sort of built-in way to, prevent NFL teams from being, bad people and just basically ripping up all the contracts, there are cap consequences that come when you cut a player prematurely, when you decide to rip up that contract before it plays out or expires. And that comes in the form of dead money. Now, dead money is essentially the unrealized portion of the remaining bonus money on the contract. So in the example we used earlier, where a player got a $10 million bonus on a 5-year contract, which is $2 million per year, right? The first year he gets $2 million of that. And then after that, there's $8 million left. After the second year, right, he gets another $2 million. And now there's $6 million left, right? After year 3, with only 2 years left on the deal, there's $4 million left, and so on and so forth. And so what happens is when a player gets cut, and it does depend on the time of year how this works, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of today's episode when we talk about post-June 1 cuts. But that remaining portion of that dead money then gets accelerated to the current year's salary cap as a penalty. So again, we're using the example, the 5-year, $25 million contract with a $10 million bonus. Let's say that, the first 2 wells of this player's, of this new deal went well, but then he got hurt in his 3rd year. And the team had a young backup that they drafted that came in, replaced him when he was out hurt and played really well. And now the team is like, you know what? We just, you're getting up at, you're 30 now. We got this young kid, 23. You know what? We don't need you anymore. We're ready to move on from you. And so they cut him after the 3rd year going into year 4. And so now in this instance, with 2 years left on his contract, there's $4 million in dead money that now gets accelerated to the contract. That's the unrealized prorated bonus from the last 2 years of his contract, right? Now, you go back and we remember part of the structure of the sample contract was his year 4 cap hit is $6 million, the $4 million base plus the $2 million in bonus money. So we can calculate how much the team saves against the salary cap by taking the cap hit and subtracting the dead money. So in this instance, $6 million cap hit minus $4 million in dead money means that the team is actually saving $2 million in cap space. They're adding $2 million in their salary cap space, right? Instead of paying the player $6 million to play for them, they're now essentially, at least as far as their books are concerned, paying a player $4 million to go play somewhere else. So this is why you'll hear me talk about, when we talk about these player contracts and we talk about the big numbers, right? 5 years, $75 million, but really it's a 2-year, $3 million deal, right? That's why you hear me when we talk about Caleb McGarry in a couple of weeks, we're talking about the contracts to pay Caleb McGarry, is like, I'll be like, yeah, give him 4 or 5 year contract, but really it needs to be like a 2-year contract. You need to be able to get out of the contract in 2 years. And this is kind of what we're talking about with the bonus money, right? Where we're really calculating the point in the contract where a team can actually get rid of the player. And so basically the contract works as, it's really, instead of a 5-year deal, it's really a 3-year deal. And then we'll see, right? And then they play it by ear after that point in time. Now, this is where the amount of guarantees come into play for a contract, right? Where it's basically, you have guaranteed money in the first X number of years of the contract, and then there's no more guaranteed money, which usually means that's the time when the team can move on from you. And at its basic level, guarantees are referring to the bonus money in the contract, right? That's signing bonus, that's roster bonus, that's all the other bonuses, but primarily signing bonus. Right? Because essentially the way that works is like when you go into that room and you're signing your contract and Arthur Blank's looking over your shoulder, right? And then he hands you the check for $3 million for your signing bonus, right? That's the only money that you're guaranteed to get because you're not going to get the rest of your money until you actually play some football games this season. But the way that NFL teams try to entice free agents is by giving them larger guarantees, right? Because players know at some point, if they want to get rid of me, they can. So the way that I, bet on myself or or work against that is by getting more guaranteed money that prevents them from getting rid of me. And typically that comes in the way of guaranteeing base salaries, right? And typically in an NFL contract, those are the early years of the base salary, right? The lower numbers tend to get guaranteed rather than the higher numbers in these backloaded contracts, right? And so the way this works is, in addition to the bonus money that accelerates as dead money, if a player has guaranteed base salaries, that is also included in the dead money. So in our previous example, where the player was getting cut headed into his fourth year after 3 seasons, right? And the team would have saved $2 million against the salary cap by cutting him because he had a $6 million cap hit with $4 million in dead money. Let's imagine this player, the sample player, had a really good agent that managed to guarantee a lot more of his contract. And his fourth year base salary of $4 million was fully guaranteed, right? So instead of just the $4 million in dead money accelerating to the cap when the player got cut, now it's $8 million. It's the $4 million in dead money, right? And bonus money, plus the $4 million in that guaranteed base salary. So now the team is going to be penalized by trying to cut the player, because instead of saving $2 million by cutting him, right, they're actually going to take on $2 million in extra salary cap, right? Because his original cap hit was $6 million. By cutting him because he has that guaranteed salary, it's now going to cost them $8 million. So they're actually losing $2 million in cap space, which usually works out where an NFL team is not going to cut that player in that situation unless they're a real problem, and they'll basically take the L on that front. But generally speaking, NFL teams do not like to have huge numbers of guaranteed dead money on their books, right? That's why such a big deal was made about the Falcons taking on this historic amount of dead money from the Julio Jones trade and the Matt Ryan trades and all this various things, because typically NFL teams do not want to pay players to not produce for them. There's a certain amount that they're willing to pay, but it's usually low. But typically NFL teams want to minimize dead money. But in the case of the Falcons, they had to kind of tear it down so that they could rebuild it. But we'll talk about when cuts happen changes how the dead money acceleration works. All right. And that's where we'll get into the post June 1 designation or post June 1 cap cut as we continue today's Salary Cap 101 on today's Free Agent Friday of Locked On Falcons. But today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. And you've heard me talk about this fun new mobile game that those of you that ever have dreamed of becoming an NFL GM, that want to manage every aspect of your team, whether it's hiring or firing coaches and coordinators, making trades, navigating through the draft, free agency, going through all the ups and downs of an NFL season. Well, guys, this is the game for you. I've already mentioned a couple of times now that, one of the fun things interacting with the Locked On listeners in the Discord that have downloaded the game, they like to talk about how much fun they enjoy the game, how hard the game is, how challenging it is. I can attest to those challenges. I started my season 2-1, my first season, and I was like, yeah, this is going to be easy. And then we lost 11 straight, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to get fired. So if you want to join and challenge yourself amongst the other Locked On listeners, well, guess what? We're starting a Locked On League. All you got to choose the Locked On League in the app to join. And you can also get a 100% free boost to your franchise when you use the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On, LOCKEDON in all caps. So make sure you check it out today and download the game by visiting ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So the last tidbit that we're going to touch upon, in addition to talking about trades towards the end, is when you cut a player in the NFL matters, because it changes the rules of how the dead money works, right? There are two different phases in the NFL calendar that work differently when it comes to cutting a player, right? There's the initial phase, which is the phase that we are currently in, which begins at the end of the season, so February, right? And goes through the start of the new league year when free agency kicks off in March, right? Which this year specifically is the Ides of March, March 15th. So beware, right? Jesse Bates is coming to town. But and that initial phase runs through April, May, and all the way up to June 1st. So June 1st is the last date in that phase. And that's the phase where the rules of dead money that we just discussed, right, that is pertinent to today, right, is the same, right? And this is notable because this is the time where leading up to the league year in March 15th, NFL teams have to be cap compliant, right? They have to get under that $225 million salary cap, right, beginning on March 5th, and they have to stay compliant for the rest of the year, right? And so that's why, like, how much you're saving against the cap matters when it comes to these players. And that's why, you know, all these rules about dead money and cap cuts and all these various things. But then beginning on June 2nd, how the cuts work is different. And that runs from June 2nd all the way to the end of the season. So before June 2nd, if a player is cut, all his dead money accelerates. All his bonus money accelerates as dead money, right? But on or after June 2nd, only part of it accelerates, and it's instead that dead money is spread over 2 years. So it's less of a penalty for a team to cut a player after June 1st. So in the previous example, we used an example of a team cutting a player after 3 years, right? Now let's switch it up and say that this team, the previous year, the previous June, after 2 years in this 5-year, $25 million contract, decided, you know what, we're done with this player. We feel like, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they had a premonition he's going to get hurt. Maybe they drafted a player and they're like, you know what, we love the rookie. Let's give him a chance. So they decided to cut this player after, you know, after June 2nd, coming out of his second year. Now, again, normally, right, you couldn't do that cutting him after his second year because his cap hit going into year 3 would have been $5 million, $3 million base salary, year 3 base salary plus the $2 million bonus. But there's still $6 million in unpaid bonuses, right? The year 3, year 4, and year 5 bonus money has yet to be paid. So there's $6 million, right? And so that would be cost prohibitive, cap prohibitive to cut that player with a $5 million base salary, right? Minus $6 million in dead money. That's a negative number. That means you have to take on an extra $1 million in cap consequences. And so that would prevent the team from doing so. But if they waited till after June 1st, right? If they cut that player on March 2nd, that's how it worked. But if they waited till June 2nd, it would be different. It would split. And instead, the initial burden in dead money would only be $2 million. So whatever that normal year is for, you know, bonus proration, that's what the first year is. And then the remainder gets tacked on at the end in the second year. So in this case, $2 million gets accelerated in dead money when they cut that player after June 1st. And then the other $4 million, right, because it would have been a $6 million total in dead money, the other $4 million is tacked on as dead money the following year. So the team would actually save $3 million against the salary cap by making this player a post-June 1 cut, right? Because they had a $5 million cap hit going into year 3, $2 million in dead money. They saved $3 million, but they have another $4 million in dead money in the future years. So they don't really get away from the dead money. They just allowed to split it over time. And so when you hear the term post-June 1, that's what they're referring to. Post-June 1 cut, post-June 1 trade, all these various things. And what's interesting about the current CBA that was signed initially in 2011, extended in 2020, is that teams in the month of March, so before June, are able to designate, I think, up to 2 players as post-June 1 cuts. Now, what that doesn't mean is that they can't simply apply the June rules to a March cut, right? And I'll use an example that the Falcons actually did in real life back in 2020 when they cut Desmond Trufant back in March of 2020, and they designated him as a post-June 1 cut. So what happened was Trufant was immediately cut. So in reality, he was cut. He signed with the Lions like a week later, right? So he was a free agent. He was cut. He was free to sign with another team. But the way that it was treated from a cap standpoint is he stayed on the Falcons' books in March, in April, and May. And then in June, he came off the books, right? In June, he was able to come off their books, and the Falcons were able to spread that dead money not only in 2020, but in 2021. That's what it means when you designate a player of June 1. You're basically allowing the player to test free agency today in March, even though it's essentially from a salary cap standpoint, it's like you're waiting to June to cut the player. And the reason this comes from long ago, in back in the ancient times, right? Long before the empire, right? The NFL, right, had like 2 free agent periods, right? Because teams had to actually wait till June to cut guys. So you had this March free agent period and you had this June free agent period, but because teams had already spent all their money by the time we got to June, like there was no money around for the players that got cut in June. And so this is a way for the players can get cut in March when teams are being frivolous with all their money and make bank, but the teams can still treat it like they're waiting until June to cut the guy. So it works for both parties in that sense, right? But this is why the Falcons were still carrying dead money, because they waited till after June 1st to trade Julio Jones 2 years ago, right? They were still carrying dead money in 2022, this past year, with Julio Jones, right? It's why, right, they're going to still be carrying dead money for Deion Jones's trade this upcoming season in 2023, as well as Marlon Davidson in 2023, because they cut Marlon Davidson in August, September, right? That's after June 1st, right? And they traded Deion Jones in October or whenever that was, right? After June 1st. So they had dead money in 2022 for both of those guys, but they'll still have dead money for both of those guys in 2023, right? Now, since we just talked about trading Deion Jones and Julio Jones, let's talk a little bit to wrap up today's episode about how trades work. Now, essentially, trades for the team trading a player. It works essentially like how cuts work, right? The dead money accelerates. If you trade a player, you have to eat the dead money, right? In the post June, same ways affected. The only real difference is in the instance where a player had a guaranteed salary, right? Base salary, right? Where before, if you cut that player, you'd still have to be on the hooks for that guaranteed money if the team cut the trade. But if you trade a player, the new team, the acquiring team, has to absorb that new guaranteed base salary, right? So theoretically, generally, from a cap standpoint, it's much easier to trade players because it's less of a burden from a cap standpoint when it comes to dead money than it is to cut a player. But yet trades are still rare in the NFL. And, that's a whole nother explanation. But that's part of the reason why trades have become more prominent in the NFL in recent years, I think, and probably will continue to be. But that's a whole different conversation. So we'll leave that aside for a second, why trades are rare in the NFL. But what's different when it comes to trades, when it comes to the acquiring team, the team that, say, I don't know, the Ravens decide they want to trade a player to the Falcons, Kyle Hamilton, let's say, because that's a realistic trade. The acquiring team has to take on the player's base salary. They don't take on the bonus money of a player. They just inherit the base salaries of a player when it comes to acquiring a player via trade, right? And the beauty of that is when it comes, if like, say, the Ravens were to trade, I don't know, Kyle Hamilton to the Falcons, right? Not a realistic trade, just pulling a name out of my butt. I could have used another name, but I decided not to. I don't know why. Just randomly picking a Ravens player, right? And so what happens is the acquiring team gets that player and they say, you know what, the Kyle Hamilton trade didn't work out. Probably a better example than this hypothetical Ravens trade is the real world example of what the Washington Commanders got from Carson Wentz, right? Where the Commanders inherited, I don't know, like the last 3 years of Carson Wentz's contract that he signed years ago with the Eagles, I think, from the Colts when they traded for it. It's a whole complicated thing. But basically, the point I'm trying to break is now the Commanders can cut Carson Wentz because they didn't inherit any of the bonus money and they take on no dead money. So acquiring a player via trade, this is why, everybody goes crazy at the trade deadline, is because like you can rent a player and then you can kind of get out of it for free. You can just like rent the player and you pay the base salary, whatever it is. And then you can just like, okay, well, that didn't work out. We can cut that guy and not have to deal with the consequences. And that's going to be the case. That's going to be the real world case when Washington, as everybody expects them to cut Carson Wentz this offseason. So, that's basically it. That's all of it, in terms of the basics of salary cap. I hope you guys now understand how cap hits work. I hope you now understand how dead money works and cap cuts work. You understand what's the difference between a pre or post June 1 cut / trade. You know how trades are different than cuts. Obviously, there are much more complex things. We could, I think in the episode back in 2021, we talked about how restructures work, because at that time that was going to be an important part of the Falcons offseason strategy. Probably don't need to necessarily break that down on today's episode, because the Falcons got all the cap space in the world, so they don't necessarily need to restructure, guys. But if you have any specific cap related questions that you would like to have answered, maybe a little bit more advanced stuff, whatever, of course, leave a comment here on YouTube or hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord, where all the ultimate football GM gurus hang out. That's in the link in the description below. You can also hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And those are all the same great places where you can send in and submit questions that you want to have answered on our next episode, which will be on Monday, which will be another Mock Draft Monday, where we will look at another mock draft from the past week and hopefully talk about a different player than what we did on last week's, talking about Myles Murphy. The Clemson defensive end. We'll probably try to talk about a new player, and we'll also open the floor. It's a mock draft Monday, and then it's also a mailbag Monday. So you guys can submit your questions via email, via Discord, via Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube comment that you want to have answered on that next episode. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and check out Locked On NFL. Locked On NFL Draft with two new hosts, and Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Braves, right? Baseball's spring training's about to start, right? Locked On Hawks, what's going on with these pesky Hawks? And Locked On Bulldogs, what's Georgia doing to rebuild? So check those out as your second listen, guys. And also, guys, I don't plug this often on the podcast because I always forget to. Hang out if you want to join the Discord, right? It's free. It's easy. Just click the link. It's all open to all comers. But on Saturdays, we do a symposium. I call it Saturday Symposium. I love alliteration, right? Mock Draft Monday, all that stuff. Free Agent Friday. I love alliteration. The brand is strong. But we do symposiums, right, at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So, and basically what they are is a Twitter space, just exclusive to the Discord, and you can come by and do what many people have done. We've been doing them since like week 2 of the regular season. And clearly, if you're just hearing about this, then clearly it illustrates my earlier point that I don't often plug it because I always forget to. But yeah, we're going to keep this going in the off season. So come by, chat us up. They usually run a couple of hours they consistently were running like 5 hours during the regular season. I would think I'm going to try to cut them off at like 2 or 3 hours during the off season, just because hey, I want to do stuff on Saturdays. Maybe be social and hang out. I love talking to you guys about the Falcons, but sometimes it's just like, okay, usually by about hour 3, it turns into, hey, you remember the Super Bowl? It's like, here we go again. I got no complaints, but it's just like, okay, usually we run out of content. So I feel like, I'll just start cutting them off at 3 hours. Cause I can't rehash, Super Bowl 51, for the 50th time this offseason. You get 3 or more Falcon fans in a room, and eventually it will lead to misery. That's the rule. That is a literal, law of nature. But anyway, I hope this doesn't discourage anybody from joining. They're fun, they're interesting, they're insightful. Come by, talk about whatever you want to talk about. Obviously, given our shared interest, it will probably be like 90% the Falcons, but there's always some interesting other things going on around the league that we can discuss, and you can ask questions directly to me that you don't necessarily have to wait to a Monday mailbag, Mock Draft Monday to ask. So you can actually talk to me directly in those. So go check us out. Just join the Discord. You'll find an announcement in the symposium section or whatever. So that is the plan. Hope you guys join. That's it. Hope you have a great weekend. Continue to check out Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.